Welcome to part 2 of our extended Q&A session with Brad Hambrick and Darby Strickland.
Darby, I have another question for you, and it has to deal with disclosure. Can you explain why it takes a victim of childhood sexual abuse so long to come forward, sometimes 15 to 20 years? And I think what maybe is behind the question too is, does a delay delegitimize the disclosure?
Yeah, I think we want to think about that really carefully, right? Often people say if it was that bad or if that happened, they would have reported at the time that it happened. And I would argue that sometimes people do. I work with many adult survivors of childhood sex abuse, and they tell me, yeah, I told my mom, and she said, are you sure? Or I told my dad, and he said, we can't talk about that to anybody. Or I told the small group leader, and they shot me down. So we don't want to assume just because something wasn't done when they were young that they didn't disclose it to someone, and that they just weren't believed and handled well. Secondly, oftentimes children don't necessarily even understand at different developmental ages what is happening to them is sexual abuse, nor do they have the words to explain what is happening to them. Also, the person who is abusing them often is threatening them. If you tell anyone, your dad's going to lose his job. If you tell anyone, I'm going to embarrass you, humiliate you. It could be the point of that someone's threatened, their life is threatened, all sorts of things. So people who abuse children control them by threatening them. I was just talking about manipulating them so they think this is their fault. Well, you wanted this to happen. I can't look what you made me do, right? They don't even have a frame for understanding that they are being perpetrated against. That's another thing that causes them not to speak. The shame and guilt, right? Just the violation, not knowing how to talk about that. And there are people who are sexually abused as children where they actually, their bodies actually shut down so that they can handle the abusive event, and they don't have clarity, or they weren't fully present and connected to their experience, so they're unsure, right? They might freeze in such a way, their mind might go elsewhere, and they can't communicate with any clarity what happened. And so, yeah, their memories are foggy around what happened. And that's just one way the body is shutting down, in a sense, the brain shutting down so that they can survive the event. But largely it's a fear of not being believed. And I think we have to think about, in today's world, we talk about sex abuse quite regularly, right? I would argue if you're talking to someone who's in their 40s and their 50s when they were a child, this wasn't something that was supported. It's only very recent that we're hearing survivor stories, they're being believed and supported. So I would imagine people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s carry these stories with them because they had no place to take them. They didn't know there was such an extra shame in being treated that way because they didn't know other people were suffering this way. But there also wasn't a society that knew what to do with that or supported that type of disclosure. I would like to think and hope that in decades moving forward with the awareness that children and teens, people would find themselves in their early 20s, they'd be able to report things sooner. I don't know that to be true, right? But I do think there is something to be said. I have sat with so many women in their 60s who will lean over to me and just barely whisper, I've never told anyone this before, but when I was 8 years old. And there's just a plethora of reasons for that. But I think you even have to go back in time to think, at 8, what decade were we in our country? What community were they in? Were they even in a supportive home environment? Because often abusers pick on children who don't have home support. So we want to try to understand what their world would have been like before we discredit their reporting their abuse now.
Thank you. Okay. Brad, if abuse happened over 15 years ago or many years ago, and the abuser claims they don't remember committing the abuse, or they consistently and adamantly deny committing the abuse, what can the church do?
Yeah. And to me, I'm going to kind of split these two apart. There's I don't remember and I deny. Now, in this, we don't have a case study that we're dealing with here, but I hear I don't remember a lot differently than I hear I deny. If you ask me, Brad, did you rob a bank? And I go, I don't remember if I robbed a bank or not. Robbing a bank is a significant enough experience that appealing to the clarity of my memory is a really odd way to get out of not saying yes. And so that's one, we can't necessarily prove that we're being lied to. At the same time, we can say that answer doesn't match what was being asked. It's really odd how that response pairs up. And that's where the early response that you get, those things are important, because once the concern has been brought to somebody and they realize like, oh, I didn't respond to that well, they can firm up their answer and begin to reply in ways that are more believable. And so sometimes we get answers that are very thinly veiled denials, and just a little bit of maturity as leaders of the church, we should be able to see through that to a denial. I think here, if I had to pick a passage of scripture that trips us up as much as any other, it's love believes all things. Kind of 1 Corinthians 13. And, somehow, I think as church leaders, we often get it in our mind that if love believes all things and this person tells me they didn't do it, it means I believe them. And somehow it doesn't apply in the same way to the person who says this happened to me. If we're talking about something that's 10 or more years past, from a legal process, earlier we talked about doing justly, we're often on the backside of statute of limitations. Investigative processes. I mean, if we go back 10 to 15 years at that point, like, do emails even exist? And, was somebody using a Hotmail account back then, and Hotmail doesn't even exist today? Maybe it does. I don't know. I don't see many people who send me emails from those accounts, but it's like any evidentiary chain that might exist has expired. And so, that's one where, as that claim comes forward, certain claims of abuse, they're more predatory. And there are indications based on what was being brought to us that this person was my coach on a sports team, and I got preferential treatment for an extended period of time. And it was, they told me that they would give me a ride home, and it was and there's enough detail about a predatory process that there's a good chance that if any of that is true, this is not the only person. And that should elicit enough concern that we as church leaders go, there's credibility here that if we were concerned for the flock, we would ask if other sheep were in danger. There's other times when there may be less predatory elements to it, that it was much more in a contained relationship, that there would not be other relationships like that. It, at the very least, as church leaders, if we're saying we don't have any way to adjudicate what did or did not happen, for us to use our pastoral influence to say love believes all things, to give the benefit of the doubt to the alleged abuser, but not give the benefit of the doubt to the alleged abused, we are being very imbalanced in the way that we are bringing that biblical principle to bear. And it may be that it results in some social awkwardness as we believe both things for both people. But I would much rather there be a social awkwardness as I try to bring a principle like that to bear in a balanced way than to apply that principle to the benefit of one person and to the detriment of another.
How often is pornography a factor in regards to the abuser?
Yeah, I often see pornography in abusive marriages that the husband, I would say more than half the time, decently more than half the time, that the husband also has a problem with pornography. Whether it rises to the level of addiction often correlates with the severity of the abuse. And I think that makes sense because we see pornography dehumanizes someone. It's about entitlement. I want to be pleased in the way I want to be pleased. So I don't, love and sex is no longer about an expression of a relationship. It's about an action. It's about what that person wants in pleasure. So it makes sense that those attitudes, someone that would regularly use pornography would also be able to abuse their wife. I find them to have a similar root. And so I find them co-occurring quite frequently.
Okay, thank you. Brad, how do I help a victim transition from victim to survivor? Is the difference between those two labels forgiveness?
I don't think the difference between those two labels is whether or not we have forgiven. I'm going to put a third kind of in a progression there. So you gave me victim and survivor. Over here, I'll put steward. And so with a victim, this is somebody who's in active harm. And so how do we help somebody transition from victim to survivor? We help them be safe. That all of the things that we do to create a context of stability and safety for them to be heard and believed, those are the things that helps somebody move from active danger to a context of safety where now they're a survivor. And at this stage, they're processing the residual effects, the aftershocks. If this is trauma per se, this is the post-traumatic stress. This is the aftershock part of it. In getting to a spot that the experience of abuse is less actively disruptive in my day-to-day life, even when the abuse is not present, that's where I'm beginning to move from survivor to steward. And one of the things that often people will find very meaningful is when they can care for others. When, whether it's as an advocate or leading a group or just being a friend, that my experience is processed enough that it's not that everybody has to know it, but when it's useful in caring for somebody else by way of testimony or something like that, I can start to draw on this in a way that I've received a comfort in this that I can share with others. We don't rush people, but I think if sometimes people have that map, I'm in active danger, that's a victim. I'm dealing with the aftershocks, that survivor. That when this is beneficial to use in caring for somebody else, I'm learning to steward and offer a comfort that I've received. It helps them locate where they are and what would be next on their journey.
Thanks, Brad. Darby, I'm going to come to you now. This question comes from a church leader, I believe. The question is, how can we as church leaders help a victim who denies help from others? In a particular case, she only wants help from pastors and elders, and they're trying to get her more help by involving an advocate.
Yeah, it's really important to have as many wise people around a victim for long-term support. And involving probably particularly another woman is a good and wise goal. And again, we want to respect the victim's pace and their particular objection. So I'd be asking her what makes you feel uncomfortable about that. She might have some good reasons, right? Maybe the people that you've proposed, she knows, are not quiet, right? They spread stories around the church. Or maybe the particular person that you've proposed is she's gone to for help before and has gotten unwise counsel. And so you really want to, in earnest, be asking me, we really want to help you. Can you be honest about, is it a particular person? Is it just a general objection? So I would learn her objections, and then you want to seek to overcome them. One way is to ask her who else she might want to involve in her care. And if it's just that she's just uncomfortable, I think we want to respect that as well, right? For her to have entrusted this to you has probably taken a lot of courage. And she's going to be really slow to bring other people in. This is shameful, right? And if other people know this, maybe it's just a burden of that. So you're going to ask her, how can we help you lift those burdens? She might fear that turning her over to somebody else for care, your involvement with her is going to stop. I know that's a fear of many victims I work with. I want to work with the pastor and the people in charge because they can help me. They're the decision makers. They're the ones that have the authority in the church. I don't. So I would really just get to know her particular objections and then gently see if you can problem solve and overcome them. Many people I have counseled, I have had to work with them for months before I've been able to say, can we bring this to your church? And it's very uncomfortable even for me to be alone with a victim in a case when I know they need so much more care. And I just feel that burden in a weightier way. And so one of my counseling goals is to get them ready to bring someone else into their story. But I'm telling them this is what's good for them. We're working in this direction. How can we get you there? So I would just say slow, paced, be consulting her, but letting her know what the benefit is. And it's hard to be patient when you're the ones knowing what she needs and yet she's not ready.
Thanks for that, Darby. Brad, this question is for you. In your first speech, you said, do believe, support, and connect the victim with the appropriate professionals. The question is, who are some of these appropriate professionals?
And I think my favorite word in that question is some, and that professionals was plural, because it gets that there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. And so if the person who's entrusted their story to us is a minor, then that's probably going to be CPS or Department of Family Services, because that's a mandated reporting situation. Right. One of my kind of simple rhyming statements to help church leaders grasp this is, if it's a child, report. If it's an adult, support. And so if a child, minor's involved, also like an elderly person not capable of self-care, then there are mandated systems that we should go to. If it's an adult, we support. They're the decision maker. We move at their pace. But let's say you have someone that they were raped. Well, that's probably going to be law enforcement. And this is one where if we have taken the time to ask some questions before we get to the moment of crisis, sometimes when it comes to talking with law enforcement, we think it's like we either do nothing or we press charges. It's like, oh, there's some other things along, like you can file a report that if you're not ready to come forward, if that feels like too big of a step, but you want it to be known that this is what was happening, you put it there with like your names in a confidential file, the person that you're filing, it's there so that if they do this to somebody else and the police department is scanning through their reports and they go, oh, wait, there's 3 people who have come forward, we could follow up. That helps the DA. They know, like, this is a more credible case. We could go back. We could tell this victim we've had other people come forward and it gives them more options. But maybe the abuse is financial. and one spouse has put all of the assets in the family in their name and all of the liabilities in the family in the name of the person who's coming to you. And they've financially hamstrung them. Well, that's where an attorney or an accountant, maybe that professional who would know the implications of here are the things that would be really important and wise for you to begin to do. And so that's one where the nature of what is being brought to us, that if we don't rely on recall thinking, and we're not going, I went to that conference and there was a flow chart and what was it the chart said, and we're trying to draw back to a recall model of thinking. If we stay in a problem-solving mode, what are they telling me? Who would be the relevant people that would help? If this was going on in my life and I wasn't overwhelmed, if my pupils weren't dilated and I could think clearly, who would I reach out to? And oftentimes, as somebody who's a step away from the situation, it's just the clarity to be able to do that kind of problem-solving thinking. And we're not saying you have to go to this person, but we're saying, I think it would be wise for you to consider, here's the kind of information that you could get. I would go along with you as a support. You don't have to do this alone, but the nature of what they're bringing to us, that's going to tell us the type of professional that may be most relevant for what they are, for the kind of help that they need.
Thanks, Brad. Okay, Darby, circling back to domestic abuse here. So the question is, why do we so often see victims of domestic abuse go back to their abuser, even going so far as to ask the church to be gentle with their abuser? And then just a couple of basically follow-up questions, as in how can church leaders respond, or how should they respond to that situation, and how can family and friends help?
Yeah, I think the statistic in the United States, on average, it takes a woman 8 times to leave before she leaves for good. So I think one thing that's just helpful is for friends and family is to say that this is, sadly, it's very normal. Again, just appealing to scripture, we see that in the Exodus story, right? When God delivered the Israelites through the Red Sea, and then they're wandering in the wilderness and they have no consistency and their world is upside down. They don't know where, they're going to have pleasant water to drink and food, right? They yearn to go back to their oppressors, right? Sometimes it's just true of us that what we know, even if it's horrible, is more comforting than what we don't know. And that's a big reality for victims. When you're extracting them from abuse, when they're choosing to leave, they're choosing more suffering. It's just of a different kind. And then there's logistical reasons for that. Perhaps they don't like having to share custody when they see their children going back and forth, right? What they're learning is happening to their children. It could be the economic consequences are too much to bear. It could be other people are shaming them and pressuring them to go back. So there's often reasons that they are compelled. They believe it's easier to return. Again, abusers have made their victims feel like the abuse is their fault. Oftentimes they feel guilty. They still feel responsible. They're trying to sort all that out. So they're confused. The confusion doesn't end just when they are out of the relationship. It persists. And so we want to find out why, and we want to really tend to their reasons. There's a plethora of reasons that they go back. And if we think about it, if it makes sense, you think about your life being so disrupted, why you would long to go back. And I think the other thing we want to just acknowledge is that often these relationships started out looking one way, right? The courtship and all that looked wonderful. All of a sudden, I'm married to this person and they're vastly different. And so they're thinking, I want to get back to that place. And they love them, right? Like, they want to help them. And so they have a heart for them that we don't understand. And that's actually a beautiful thing. We just want to shape it so that they're wise and discerning with the love that they have for them. I've seen many women call off church discipline. Please do not excommunicate my husband. His biggest hope is remaining in the church and in these relationships. And I understand their longing for that. Or it could be, yeah, I don't want you to go through the church discipline process because it's going to make things far worse for me and my children. if this has to go in that direction. And so they'll withdraw charges, probably because they're being threatened. So we want to find out what's happening in their situation. What are they afraid of? What are they longing for? And again, everybody's going to have different reasons. But I think often fleeing oppression is just as costly as remaining in abuse, right? Either way, there's a high price to be paid. And we just want to respect that and tend to those needs. And then I think as friends and family, we just don't want to get tired, right? We want be far easier if someone just made decisions and they stuck to them. But I think what we want to do is we just want to say, hey, I understand. Why did you feel the need to return? What motivated that decision? How can I support you in the midst of that decision? And if you ever change your mind, like maybe you're going to try to reunification in your marriage, but if things don't work out, or if you ever want to make a change, or if the abuse escalates to this point, yeah, like I'm here for you. Like I'm not tired of rescuing you. One question that I often ask, and I have found to be particularly fruitful, what will have to happen for you to leave next time? And so that she'll pick her pain point. Well, if he ever choked me, or if he ever harmed any of the children, and then she's kind of had to say out loud and own what her threshold is, and what she thinks is wise. And maybe it's 2 years later and I'll get the call and I say, Darby, I told you, if he ever laid a hand on the children, or yes, he did this thing that I said. And so it's giving them a way to identify what their watermark is, and the freedom for them to say, okay, now I'm ready. Now I need to do something. And just for us being able to receive that, we just don't tire of rescuing God's people because they return to the mess of what they're in. We just always have to be ready to rescue. And that's much the way the Lord is with us, right? Like we think about his word, scripture is highly repetitive, and we just don't tire of saying the same things, because the Lord doesn't tire of saying those things to us, that we are loved and valued and worthy of a rescue.
Thanks, Darby. Brad, going back to your first speech, it covered the process of how to handle responding to disclosures. Could you get a little more specific about how to investigate disclosures or charges of either sexual or domestic abuse?
Yeah. And so that's where I'm pretty cautious to give advice to church on how to investigate, because I don't think that's our role. That especially when we're talking about things that were not only immoral, but also illegal, there's a lot of things that we can do in our church lane that confound the legal process, and we actually hamper the process of our Romans 13 partners for justice. And so, and then it can also, like if we think of the context here where we come to realize that a child has been sexually abused. Well, as we as a church go through a process with that, and then there needs to be a legal process with that, how many times does that child have to tell their story? To how many people? And so that's where when we realize that kind of process is needed with a child. Oh, if we could get safe families involved. Well, what they do a very good job of it. Most of the time when I've worked with them, I've been exceedingly pleased. They set up one time. They have a nice patient process. They do the interview through where the parents can, or a parent, if one of the parents was the abuser, like there is support there. They ask the questions in a way that, if you want to use the legal term, it is memorialized, so that it's actually admissible in a court of law. If an unaware adult starts asking a bunch of leading questions because they didn't know how to ask the questions, well, there's plenty of times when the legal process goes and the gavel strikes and the conclusion of the court was not guilty. Well, not guilty is very different from innocent. Not guilty can be because something about the process wasn't done right. And that's can plenty of the times be because the church got ahead of ourselves. And so if there is a legal process, that's where getting this person connected with someone who can make sure that that information is gathered the right way, that's really important. And so, if it's often when the church either doesn't do that or the claim comes later, that we play more of an active role. Again, if I'm just talking to churches and somebody comes to us on the front side, I hate reducing things to economics. But if as church leaders, we will cooperate with the process early, the entire process is free. That it's when we don't do that, and then on the backside, we need to hire somebody to come in to find out what happened. That's when the decimal spot for the church budget starts to go up, because we didn't do that the way we should have on the front side. And so my caution with the question, and maybe you need to come back and ask me the question in a different way to get past my hesitancies, is the idea that we as the church leaders are going to investigate this in a way that we arrive at the conclusion. We're really confounding Matthew 18 and Romans 13 in a way that I think is unwise and doesn't adhere to the lanes of immoral and illegal when it's both. I think we let Romans 13 run its course first, because that's where we're going to get the information in its clearest form to know what we need to do in a Matthew 18.
Well, I don't think I have to ask the question any differently, because I agree with and appreciate your response, Brad. So, thank you.